The thunder rolled over the palace roofs like a slow drumbeat, and the corridors answered with their own quiet sounds, sandaled steps, the rustle of silk, the faint scratch of a quill. Senator Marcus Claudius stood in that long marble passage, a torch set into his hands by officials who never met his eyes. The flame shook when he breathed. He willed it steady. Along the walls, metal brackets marked precise intervals, as if geometry itself had been enlisted to serve policy. Nothing here was improvised. Everything had a measure, a distance, a procedure. Even the fear felt organized. A clerk in a recessed alcove turned pages of an imperial ledger. Names became entries, entries became numbers, numbers became outcomes. A column for date, a column for origin, a column for reason. Reason, such a comfortable word for what power decides to do. It was easier for everyone if a decision could look like arithmetic. Lightning lit the hall for a heartbeat. Marcus saw other faces beyond the glare, men he knew from debates and banquets, each gripping a torch, each practicing the same posture of endurance. An officer murmured instructions with professional courtesy, the way one might direct guests toward their seats. That courtesy felt colder than cruelty. It meant this was not an outburst or a whim. It was a system. Behind the doors, voices rose and fell. The cadence of questions, the formal language of oaths, the impersonal tone of assessment. No one spoke of pain, and yet the architecture itself taught dread. Windows were placed where witnesses could be made to watch, and thresholds were set where no one might intervene. The message was not about spectacle, it was about helplessness. Years earlier, people had cheered a new dawn, generosity at the games, relief from taxes, parades of gratitude. But something had shifted after an illness, or perhaps the illness only revealed what had always been there, the conviction that one life could claim the right to define every other. The first changes were subtle, reassignments, new posts, new departments with unfamiliar mandates, a palace guard chosen for obedience, a chamber redesigned for clarity, a register opened for special matters. Then policies multiplied. What used to be private excess learned to wear the clothing of law. Language smoothed the edges. Words like evaluation, service, and security made blunt force sound like civic duty. Marcus had argued in the Senate for limits, decorum, memory. He believed institutions survived on restraint. Now he understood the darker truth. Institutions also survive on paperwork. If you can write it down, you can make it normal. If you can number it, you can make it necessary. Far down the corridor, a door opened and closed with ceremonial softness. A steward passed, carrying sealed tablets for the archives. He nodded to Marcus as one professional to another, as if they shared a craft instead of a catastrophe. The senator's torch smoked, and a black thread curled toward the ceiling. He thought of his home, of a table laid for evening bread, of the way quiet can feel like safety. He tried to count breaths, to borrow time in small coins. The officer returned, voice smooth as polished stone. "Hold it steady, Senator. Proper illumination is a sign of respect." Respect for whom? For process, apparently. For the Empire's favorite illusion. That order is the same as justice. The thunder answered from the hills, and the palace answered with ink. Somewhere a number was added to a page. Somewhere a life was moved from one column to another. In that cold light, Marcus finally saw the shape of the machine. It did not rage. It recorded. It did not shout. It standardized, and it asked each witness to become part of its shine. If these hidden histories matter to you, stay with me. There is more to uncover in the shadows, much more. The storm outside faded into steady rain, tapping against the tall windows, as though the sky itself wanted to be admitted as witness. Inside, the marble floors gleamed with torchlight, and the air felt too still, as if silence itself had been trained to obey. Marcus shifted the torch from one hand to the other, his arm already aching from the weight. Each senator knew the choreography by now, where to stand, how to angle the flame, when to lower their gaze. None of them had been given a script, yet every gesture was rehearsed through repetition. A system had no need for instructions once fear had been installed in the mind. Clerks at their desks continued their work without pause. Ink stained their fingers, and their eyes rarely lifted. They recorded not stories but figures, dates, measurements, outcomes. To read their tablets would be to think you were auditing harvests or stone shipments. Yet behind each line hid a family, a household, a lineage slowly disassembled. It was the language that betrayed the truth. Bureaucracy does not use words like cruelty. It prefers compliance, adjustment, allocation. Words chosen to remove the weight of conscience, to turn lives into inventory. Marcus wondered if one day his own name would be written not as senator, but as column entry. When Caligula had first taken the throne, no one would have believed such scenes possible. He had appeared as the golden promise, young, charming, heir to the beloved general Germanicus. Citizens had called him Little Boots, a name of affection that spoke of trust. His early actions were generous, even dazzling. Festivals, relief, rewards for soldiers. Rome had felt as if dawn had broken after years of twilight. But dawn proved a mirage. 6 months into his reign, a sickness nearly claimed him. When he returned, those closest swore he was no longer the same. The fever had not only burned his body, it had scorched away restraint. At first, disappearances were whispered about. A servant no longer seen in the markets, a kitchen attendant missing from her post, a family withdrawing in shame. Explanations circulated. Perhaps they fled, perhaps they sinned, perhaps they fell ill. But then the bodies surfaced in rivers, and whispers sharpened into fear. Still the people excused him. A young ruler would surely outgrow excess. He would steady, they said. He would learn. But instead of maturing, he systematized. By the following year, specialized offices appeared, roles with titles that sounded harmless: master of pleasures, overseer of acquisitions, guardian of divine service. Each department filed reports, kept ledgers, maintained schedules. It was no longer impulse, it was administration. Marcus and men like him realized too late that tyranny wrapped in procedure becomes harder to confront. A single act of cruelty can be condemned. A ledger entry looks like progress. The thunder subsided, leaving only the rhythm of rain and the faint scratching of quills. Marcus thought of his daughter at home, still untouched by the machinery that devoured others. He closed his eyes for a moment, but the officer's voice returned. "Keep them open, Senator. The Emperor values vigilance." So he opened them again, staring into the corridor's endless geometry, where each flicker of light carved shadows that resembled bars. Somewhere deep inside, he felt what all the fathers felt but could not voice, that their torches did more than illuminate halls. They illuminated complicity. To stand and hold the flame was to admit that power had reached into their very bones. Yet who could defy it? Who could lay down the torch without endangering everything they loved? And so the empire continued. Stone, ink, flame, silence. Rome, which had once built aqueducts and amphitheaters, now perfected a darker invention, the industrialization of fear. And Marcus, trembling beneath the weight of duty and love, learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes survival meant surrendering to the ritual, even as your soul recoiled. But history remembers, the ruins remember, and tonight you too will see how that memory was carved not in marble, but in human silence. Stay with me. The rain had slowed to a mist, and with it came a deceptive calm that made the palace feel like a tomb dressed in gold. The torches along the walls hissed softly, smoke curling into the high ceilings where painted gods watched in silence. Marcus held his torch as ordered, and though his face remained outwardly calm, his mind roared with questions. How had Rome, so proud of its laws, its dignity, its traditions, become a place where silence replaced justice and ritual replaced compassion? The answer was written not only in the emperor's desires, but in the compliance of those around him. It began with small compromises. A senator excused one excess, thinking it harmless. A general dismissed one disappearance, believing it isolated. A priest justified a new ritual, claiming divine precedent. Step by step, excuse by excuse, the extraordinary became ordinary. And when ordinary life wears the mask of cruelty, no one notices when lines are crossed. Marcus had argued once, raising his voice in the Senate to warn against unchecked authority. His colleagues had avoided his gaze, unwilling to share his courage. He was left to stand alone, and he learned quickly that the empire did not punish dissent with open blows, it punished with waiting. Now the waiting was over. His presence in that corridor, torch in hand, was not a coincidence, but a lesson. The system did not need him to act. It needed him to witness, to watch and to accept, to stand still while the ledgers recorded names and the corridors swallowed echoes. That was the true genius of this cruelty, to turn protectors into onlookers, to make silence itself a form of participation. The empire thrived not on the will of one man alone, but on the obedience of thousands. Clerks continued their meticulous work, their faces emotionless as they catalogued humanity into neat columns. To them, it was not horror, but routine, an endless stream of figures. The empire had discovered a dangerous secret. Once pain is reduced to numbers, it becomes tolerable. Once it is filed under policy, it becomes invisible. The marble pillars gleamed with reflected firelight. But Marcus no longer saw grandeur. He saw a prison, not of stone, but of duty. Each senator, each father stood chained by the same invisible bonds, the need to protect their families by yielding, the fear of losing everything if they resisted. The rain outside grew lighter, and with it, a faint wind carried the scent of wet earth into the hall. It was the only reminder that beyond these walls, life still carried on. Children still laughed, mothers still cooked meals, farmers still worked fields. That contrast cut deeper than cruelty itself. Rome was an empire of paradoxes, building aqueducts to nourish while constructing chambers to destroy, writing poetry to honor the gods while drafting ledgers to reduce souls to statistics. Marcus's hand trembled, and he clenched the torch harder, forcing steadiness. He thought of the generations that would follow, of daughters who might never understand why their fathers stood so still, why their voices stayed silent. He feared they would inherit not courage, but resignation, not freedom, but the memory of compliance, and yet the system ensured he had no choice. His silence was survival, his endurance the only shield left. This was Rome's new face, a place where cruelty became architecture, where fear became ceremony, and where fathers became symbols of powerlessness. And Marcus, like so many before him, learned that the greatest violence was not always in the act itself, but in the way it forced even the innocent to hold the torch steady. The palace still hums with those lessons. Its corridors still echo, not with screams, but with silence so heavy it bends the soul. And we must follow this silence further, for it leads us to the heart of an empire that traded compassion for control. The palace corridors seemed endless, each turn leading only to more marble, more firelight, more silence. Marcus's torch sputtered, and the smoke stung his eyes. He could almost believe the air itself conspired to keep witnesses weary and compliant. The design of the place was deliberate, floors polished to mirror brightness, so each man saw not only the guards but also his own reflection, distorted by flickering flame. The message was cruelly simple. You are part of this. Even if you speak no word, even if you lift no hand, your presence confirms the process. The scribes continued their work nearby, whispering to one another in the clipped tones of administration. They spoke not of people, but of classifications. Words like premium, standard, and utility rolled from their lips with mechanical ease. Each term seemed harmless, but behind them lay fates too heavy to name aloud. This was the true power of language, to dress horror in neutral clothing, to make the unbearable sound like order. And so the empire turned lives into categories, erasing individuality with ink and parchment. Marcus remembered when Rome prided itself on names, names of ancestors, names of victories, names carved in stone to endure forever. Now those names were dissolving into ledgers, replaced by numbers. What was once identity became inventory. What was once a daughter became an entry. He wondered if memory itself would soon collapse under the weight of so many records, if Rome would forget its children as easily as it forgot its promises. The transformation of cruelty into procedure had happened so gradually that few recognized its danger. At first, people believed the rituals were rare, isolated, perhaps even exaggerated, but when a system repeats itself, when it writes down its actions and files them away, denial becomes impossible. Every tablet preserved in archives, every report sealed with wax, added another layer of permanence. This was not impulse. This was policy. And policy, once established, spreads like wildfire. Outside, the rain had stopped. The storm had passed, but the thunder seemed to linger in memory, as though the very air carried echoes of what had unfolded. Marcus thought of his colleagues who had once toasted to Caligula's health, believing him to be Rome's savior. They had cheered his generosity, welcomed his charm, trusted his bloodline. Now, many of those same men stood here, torches trembling in their hands, unable to meet one another's eyes. Rome had not simply been betrayed by its emperor, it had betrayed itself by applauding too soon, by excusing too often, by remaining silent too long. The guards shifted their weight, their armor creaking softly. They too were bound by the system, though their chains were forged from loyalty and fear. For them, duty meant obedience, and obedience meant survival. Perhaps they told themselves they were only following orders. Perhaps they believed history would not remember their faces. But history has a way of whispering through ruins, of reminding future generations that silence and obedience are never neutral. Marcus's thoughts turned inward. He wondered how many more nights like this he could endure before his spirit fractured. How many more times he could stand with a torch in hand while his heart burned hotter than the flame. He prayed, not to the gods of Rome, but to the fragile hope that someday someone would remember, that the ruins would outlast the empire's excuses, that the truth, even buried under ledgers and procedures, would rise again. And perhaps that is why we still speak of these nights, because they teach us a lesson Rome tried to bury, that the greatest danger is not only the cruelty of one ruler, but the machinery of silence that allows cruelty to thrive. Marcus held his torch, and in that simple act he became both victim and accomplice. And that duality, the collapse of protector into participant, is what made this system more terrifying than any single act of violence. The flame wavered, steadying again, as though even fire had learned the rhythm of obedience. The corridor stretched on, endless, oppressive, waiting for the next name, the next entry, the next silent witness. And Rome continued, draped in gold, while its foundations cracked beneath the weight of what it had chosen not to see. The hours passed without measure, as though time itself had been conscripted into the emperor's service. Marcus's arm ached from the torch, yet he did not dare lower it. Around him, the other senators stood in the same rigid posture, each a statue carved from duty and despair. The corridor had become a theatre, not of spectacle, but of silence, an endless rehearsal of obedience. The torches flickered, casting wavering shadows that seemed almost alive, as if the walls themselves carried the memory of what had been done within them. By now, Marcus understood the true nature of this machinery. It was not rage, not even indulgence, but method. Cruelty had been distilled into procedure, and procedure had become tradition. What began as whispers of excess had grown into a ritual so entrenched that to refuse participation felt as impossible as refusing gravity. The empire had turned private corruption into public duty, ensuring that every man of rank bore some share of the stain. Guilt became communal, and in that shared weight, resistance dissolved. In the stillness, Marcus thought of his daughter, her laughter, her innocence, her trust. He thought of how children looked to fathers as shields against the world, and how here in this place shields were shattered deliberately. That was the most insidious part, not the act itself, but the way it broke the bond between protector and protected. Fathers who should have defended became witnesses, mothers who should have comforted lived in dread. Children who should have grown in safety learned instead that survival meant silence. The storm outside had passed completely, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet stone. From a distance, Rome must have seemed at peace, its markets bustling, its temples filled, its citizens carrying on with daily life. Yet beneath that surface, the empire's heart was corroding. It was not invaded armies that threatened Rome, but the rot within, the loss of trust, the normalization of cruelty, the erosion of human dignity disguised as ceremony. A scribe closed his ledger with a soft snap, sealing another day's entries. To him it was just paperwork. To Marcus it was proof that nothing in Rome escaped record, that even despair could be catalogued, bound, and preserved. He wondered if future generations would find these ledgers in some ruined archive. Would they understand what the numbers meant? Would they see not columns but faces, not statistics but lives? Or would they too be lulled by the neutrality of ink, believing the empire's story rather than its victims? At last, the corridor emptied. The torches were collected, the clerks dismissed, the guards relaxed their posture. Marcus walked out into the night, the cool air hitting him like a wave. He should have felt relief, but instead he felt hollow. The rain-slick streets shone under the moonlight, and Rome sprawled before him, majestic, eternal, unshaken. Yet he carried with him the knowledge that majesty often hides decay, that eternity can be an illusion, and that silence is its own kind of betrayal. He knew he would return again, summoned by the same commands, holding the same flame, and each time a little more of him would vanish, reduced not by age but by complicity. That was the empire's true design, not merely to destroy lives, but to break spirits until survival itself felt like surrender. The ruins that remain today still whisper these truths. Empty torch brackets along crumbling walls, fragments of ledgers unearthed by archaeologists, testimonies scratched into stone by desperate hands, all remind us that when cruelty wears the face of order, when silence is demanded as proof of loyalty, entire civilizations can collapse from within. So remember this, power unchecked is never just about one man. It is about the system that records, organizes, and sustains his will. Rome fell not only to enemies at its gates, but to the shadows it cultivated within. And as we walk through history's ruins, we must ask ourselves, what torches are we holding steady today, and at what cost? Because some flames do not light the way. They only reveal the darkness we have agreed to ignore.